Hello, everyone. I'm really pleased to be joined by Niall Ferguson, who's kindly agreed to speak to me today. Niall is, of course, a world-leading historian and a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. He's also taught at Cambridge and Oxford and was, for 12 years, professor of history at Harvard. He has written numerous books on a range of subjects, including the British Empire, the First World War, the Rothschild family, Henry Kissinger, and most recently, of course, he's written The Square in the Tower, a survey of networks and hierarchies through history. He also writes regularly on current affairs, and in the current crisis, his work has been both prescient and historically informed. Niall, thank you so much for joining me. Really appreciate
Thank you,
it.
Curran. It's a pleasure to be Zooming from darkest Montana all the way to darkest Cornwall, where I believe you are.
It is amazing how we can communicate across such vast distances. I've been reading what you were writing earlier in the year about the threat that you saw was going to be posed by the coronavirus. And it seemed that you were making this warning far earlier than many people. And it seems certainly the British and the American governments didn't take this threat seriously soon enough. Why do you think so many people didn't take it seriously?
Not enough history, too much PPE is the answer I'm tempted to give. I started writing about this, I think, before most journalists. I'm not a journalist. It's my hobby to write a newspaper column, but I was in Asia in early January. I was in Hong Kong, in Taipei, and then in Singapore. And I heard enough from people there to realize that something very bad was happening in Wuhan, in China. And so I went to the World Economic Forum in mid-January, expecting that there would be a serious conversation about this. And instead, we were all expected to pay obeisance to Greta Thunberg and talk about climate change, because that was the agenda for the World Economic Forum this year. I went around saying, but this is silly. There's a pandemic coming at full speed towards us. This isn't really the time to talk about the relatively slow-moving problem of climate change. But relatively few people took me seriously when I said that. There were some exceptions, but most people were not really paying attention. And I think even into February, it was very hard to get people in London or Washington to pay attention to what was rapidly turning into a global disaster. I was in Washington in mid-February at a Hoover Institution board meeting and met with a number of people in the Trump administration. And by that stage, I was more or less grabbing people by the lapels and shaking them to try to get them to take things seriously. This was a time when, unfortunately, President Trump was assuring people that it would simply fade away. It was nothing more than an influenza. In fact, the influenza was worse. A message, by the way, that the liberal media in the US quickly took up. And so it was a bipartisan misreading of the situation. Finally, in the middle of March, after 2.5 lost months, the governments woke up to the problem, realized that what was happening in Italy could happen very easily in the southeast of England or in the northeast of the United States, and they panicked. They were panicked, unfortunately, by another person called Niall Ferguson, and I should make it clear that I'm not him. The epidemiologist at Imperial College has become something of a hate figure, because his model back in mid-March predicted that we'd have 500,000 deaths in the UK and 2.2 million in the US if you didn't lock down the economy. Well, luckily, he spells his name Neil, and I spell my name Niall. And now I understand why my parents opted for the obscure Gaelic spelling, because if they hadn't, I think I'd probably get more death threats than is entirely comfortable. I got enough from people who can't spell. Anyway, the government saw this report, saw these numbers, flipped, and began locking down the UK and US economies with, I think, pretty disastrous results and minimal public health benefits, to be honest. I was, by this stage, more or less entirely obsessed with the pandemic. And the reason I was obsessed with it was just that as an historian, I'd seen this movie before. The most obvious illustration of this is that I'd studied the 1918-19 influenza pandemic when I was writing a book called The Pity of War about World War I. And so I fully understood, I think, that a new contagious pathogen with a relatively high infection fatality rate was a global problem, much bigger than anything else that we were confronting this year. It was just a source of utter despair to me that the policymakers in both the US and the UK were so slow to realize the scale of the risk. And then when they did realize it, ended up doing a bunch of things that really were quite counterproductive. And we've ended up, therefore, in a relatively big mess. Excess mortality in the UK is higher than for any EU member state, worse than for Italy, worse than for Spain. And although the US isn't quite as bad as the UK in terms of that measure of excess mortality, it's a lot worse than it should have been. And so I think the bottom line is, if policymakers don't know history, you end up making these kinds of mistake. And of course, this is an argument I've been making for a long time, that applied history is the right way to approach policy problems, whether they're biological or geopolitical or financial. And unfortunately, our political elite is just too unfamiliar with the kind of history you need to know to make these big calls and get them right. I'll add one more point. I'm sorry, I've given you a very long answer, but it's a big question you asked. I think if you ask the question, who failed in 2020, the wrong answer is Boris Johnson and Donald Trump. Although that's a media answer that is very popular. In the end, it's not the prime minister or president who makes the big call on a pandemic. That is really the job of scientists that the government consults and bureaucrats whose responsibility it is to say, this is the emergency we've prepared for, time to implement the pandemic preparedness plan. I think in both the US and the UK, it was those people who really failed. And I think they didn't fail for dishonorable reasons. I think that they honorably and genuinely misunderstood the nature of the coronavirus threat, were prepared more for a new influenza than for a new coronavirus. But when I look in the US, where I'm now based, what I see is a really colossal failure at the Department of Health and Human Services. Really, really colossal. They did not need to screw this up the way they did. And very little media coverage has actually focused on this extraordinary failure of government, and of big government, I should say. The narrative here is all about Trump in the same way that it's become all about Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson in the UK. And this is to miss the point. We have a public health bureaucracy. Their job is partly pandemic preparedness, and they failed. And we should be asking why they failed, because if we don't ask that question, we won't learn anything from this searing experience.
And of course, this isn't just a public health emergency. You've talked about how this is now turning into a catastrophic economic crisis. Thinking about history, do you think this could be as bad as, say, for example, the 1930s depression? And what sort of social and political impacts could this have if we see the economy going down the way of the 1930s?
Well, currently it already is by a number of measures as bad as the early 1930s. Unemployment in the United States will likely reach 1932 levels the next time the official number is published. I expect it to be around 25%, could even be higher than the 1932 peak. Output, measured in terms of gross domestic product or manufacturing output, has fallen off the proverbial cliff. It's declining by bigger amounts than we've seen in any period since the 1930s. So in a sense, we've already got to Great Depression levels of unemployment and contraction of economic activity. It's just that we've got there really fast. What's interesting is that we are achieving in months what it took people years to achieve in the 1930s. Unemployment in the US didn't peak until 1932, as I mentioned, 3 years after the Wall Street crash. Well, we've got there in 3 months. So I would say we're rerunning the Great Depression, but with the tape speeded up by a factor of about 12. And this is a terrifying phenomenon because it makes what happened after 2008, 2009 seem quite trivial, kind of common or garden recession by comparison with this high-speed depression. The problem is that we can get into depression very fast. If you shut down the economy, of course, output will collapse and unemployment will soar. Getting out of it is another matter. And those people in the city of London and Wall Street who say there'll be a V-shaped recovery, in other words, we'll get out as fast as we got in, I think are smoking dope. It's impossible that we will recover so swiftly. All that we've learned from the period after 2009 is that recoveries are slow, and it took 6 years to get back to the unemployment rate that we'd seen pre-crisis back then. I shudder to think how long it will take to recover from this shock. And this shock is in many ways a self-inflicted one. As I mentioned earlier, I don't think that we really needed to do these economic lockdowns. If we'd acted the way they did in Taiwan, swiftly with testing and contact tracing in January, we wouldn't have got into this mess. Now, it's true that no European countries did quite that well, but the Germans certainly have done better than we've done. And I don't see any obvious reason why that should be. It's not as if they don't have big cities in Germany. It's not as if they didn't have exposure to the Chinese economy in Germany. So I think that's the way that one should think about this. It's a huge self-inflicted economic disaster. It will be very hard to recover from. And for the ordinary people whose lives have been blighted by this, who can't, like me, do their jobs via Zoom, but require there to be normal economic and social circumstances to work, this is a disaster, and a disaster that will take years to recover from.
And of course, people think about being able to start to come out of lockdowns now, and I don't think seem to realise it's very likely there will be a second wave, and a vaccine might not be found. So, do you think people are going to eventually come to terms with this, and how are people going to respond to the idea that we might have to live with COVID-19?
Well, at the moment, investors in the US are in a kind of cheerful mood. We've just had the Memorial Day weekend. If you look at mobility indicators, there's a distinct return to the amounts of mobility that we would expect to see at this time of year. According to the Apple data, SafeGraph has some different numbers that show it's not really quite back to where it was, but in, say, Dallas or Houston, you're seeing foot traffic up to 70% of normal, where it was down at 40% in the depths of the panic. And there's also optimism amongst investors about a vaccine. Every piece of good news, whether it's from Moderna or from Oxford, is kind of front page news. The bad news I never see on the front page, and there is bad news. It is not necessarily possible to find a vaccine against a coronavirus like this. It may be that, like other vaccines in the past, at best it's a kind of a possibly successful vaccine. At worst, it has side effects that we miss because we rush to get this thing to market. There's a whole lot that can go wrong. If we do get a vaccine in the time frame people are talking about, i.e. a breakthrough this year and mass distribution next year, it will be unprecedented because we really don't see such a rapid transition from research to deployment in any recent successful vaccine. So I have to say, be cautious about this because there are some diseases for which you don't get a vaccine. HIV, AIDS is a good example of this. Now, I think it's probably more likely that we'll have a successful vaccine for SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19 than for HIV/AIDS, because HIV/AIDS is a particularly tricky customer when it comes to vaccination. But I just don't think it's a certainty that we're going to solve this. There are so many unknowns still about this virus and the disease it causes that I find the current mood of optimism baffling, frankly. It seems to me very clear that with people returning to normal levels of economic activity and social activity in parts of the US, there will be an increased number in cases. There will be an increased number of hospitalizations and fatalities in those states that most rapidly try to normalize. It'd be really bizarre if that didn't happen. I wrote a piece about a second wave a while ago. All the great pandemics in history have had multiple waves. It'd be really odd if this one didn't. It's conceivable. There is a scenario in which it sort of obliges us by going away. But I think that only happens if you have the kind of systems of contact tracing, testing, and persistent social distancing that you see in Asia. We're not doing any of that. And if you look at the 50 states of the Union, what's really striking is that only 6 of them have really got this thing under control. Another 6 are getting there. All the rest still have either rising numbers of cases or at best a plateau. And I think those that have plateaued, like Texas, will quickly see another uptick given the way that people are behaving. So I just think we're seeing a kind of another outbreak of magical thinking in Wall Street, and not only in Wall Street, about where this is likely to go. I would, to use American football parlance, say that we're probably not even at the end of the first quarter of this pandemic, and people are acting like it's nearly over. I find that bizarre.
Well, that sounds quite depressing.
It is depressing. And actually the word depression is relevant here because not only in economic terms are we in a depression, but I think being locked down and having social distancing is depressing. Most people are quite sociable by nature. It's one of our evolved traits as a species. And this is depressing. I'm abnormal. I quite like being stuck on my own with just my family and books to read and write. This is my sort of natural habitat. I'm enjoying being in the middle of nowhere with no social obligations beyond Zoom calls. But I'm really abnormal, and it's really unusual to be able to do what you do through sort of apps like Zoom. Most people are miserable. They find being stuck at home frustrating. And certainly in the US, a significant proportion of people are eager to get back to work. I think it's slightly different in the UK from what I can gather. It's been a lovely spring. People have quite enjoyed being stuck with nothing but gardening to do, or video games if that's what they prefer. They're getting money from Rishi Sunak. I get the sense that people in the UK are in no hurry to actually end the lockdowns and get back to work. But that is still, I think, compatible with depression and indeed other forms of psychological harm, at least in parts of the population.
In terms of the coronavirus, in historical terms, there are some commentators who have written about coronavirus as a hinge event in world history, comparable or even more significant than, say, 9/11. And I think that might be too premature to say with certainty at the moment. And I was thinking about the Spanish flu in history and how the Spanish flu affected people's historical and cultural identity through the 20th century. And it doesn't really seem to have figured that significantly until now. We're talking about pandemics. Obviously, we're going to talk about the Spanish flu. So do you think we're being too premature to start talking about coronavirus as a world-changing historical event, or is it far more significant than, say, the influenza flu that went through at the start of the 20th century?
Well, I saw my former boss, Larry Summers, writing about the hinge of history, and indeed Henry Kissinger, another Harvard alum, has written in similar terms recently in the Wall Street Journal. I'm in the midst of writing Kissinger's biography. It's what I should really be doing this morning rather than talking to you. But I think one should take seriously a Kissinger or a Summers. These are brilliant men, actually two of the most brilliant people I've ever come across in my life. And when I hear others arguing, oh, this is just going to accelerate pre-existing trends, it's no biggie, which I think was Richard Haas's point in the recent Foreign Affairs essay, I'm inclined to side with Summers and Kissinger. But you're right to express a little skepticism, because it's very hard to know at this stage in any kind of disaster, whether it's natural or man-made, what the consequences will be. I wrote a paper that I finished a couple of weeks ago which had the rather exotic title Grey Rhinos, Black Swans, and Dragon Kings. And the argument of that paper was that it's very hard at the beginning to know which historical disasters will have massive epoch-making consequences. 1914, the outbreak of World War I, certainly had such consequences. It qualifies as a Dragon King. It was also a Grey Rhino because before the event, people often said there was a risk of a major European war. And it was a Black Swan because when it happened, everybody was amazed, shocked, stunned. How could this possibly be? And the exact same sequence of events has happened in our time. Lots of people predicted a pandemic, including me, but Bill Gates more famously, and many other people, Larry Brilliant, Martin Rees, great Cambridge man. And yet, when it actually happened, it suddenly turned from a Grey Rhino you see coming from miles off. A Black Swan is something you never could have conceived of, and it morphed from Grey Rhino into Black Swan in the early part of this year. What we don't yet know is if it's a Dragon King, that is to say, one of these events that is epoch-making, that has consequences far greater than, say, the typical public health emergency. And I think it could well be, not because of the public health crisis itself, because I don't think that it's going to kill nearly as large a percentage of the population as the 1918-19 influenza, which was a really deadly disease with an infection fatality rate above 2, i.e. 2%. I think the IFR of COVID-19 is probably closer to 0.3 to 0.7%. And that actually puts it as a public health disaster much closer to the 1957-58 pandemic, another influenza pandemic that most people have forgotten about. Because I just don't see the death toll getting close to 1918-19, which killed nearly 3% of humanity. This is not going to do that. Even if we bungle completely our response, I don't think it's going to do that. But it's the economic measures and the economic shock we've created that could turn this into a Dragon King, because we've created the major economies of the world. It's proving really hard to overcome that. There's also the geopolitics of it. It's not clear to me that the real significance of COVID-19 will lie in the ultimate death toll. It may get to 1 million people, in which case Martin Rees wins his bet with Steve Pinker. But that's not an enormous percentage of the human race. And if most of the people it kills are elderly, in fact have left the economically active population, it's really quite a mild pandemic compared with 1957-58, which killed a lot of young people, killed a lot of young kids, killed a lot of teenagers, interestingly. So in terms of the impact, the proximate impact on humanity, I don't think COVID-19 is anywhere close to 1918-19 influenza. But in terms of the economic consequences and potentially the geopolitical consequences, which we can talk a little bit about in a minute, I think it's already on the way to being a colossal event in human history, much more significant than 9/11, because this is like 9/11 happening week after week after week instead of just once. The real problem, if you like, about thinking about terrorism is that the Islamists only achieved one really large terrorist attack in the Western world, only one, and all the others were really quite small by comparison. Whereas COVID-19 is a much more effective and efficient killer than Islamic extremism.
Talking about geopolitics, of course, this pandemic originated in China, and the Chinese Communist Party next year will celebrate its centenary. And it seems Beijing is trying to craft a narrative about what has happened in the past few months, in which it presents itself as having effectively dealt with the pandemic and is now going to be in some way the savior of humanity. How effective do you think this propaganda is working in the West?
Well, it's a little hard to answer that question. You're right to say that China has tried to use propaganda and indeed fake news to counter the obvious evidence that it's to blame for the initial outbreak, and they failed to contain it. if the Chinese had acted with transparency and any accountability, they'd have acknowledged that there was a dangerous new coronavirus that was transmittable between humans by the end of December, and they would have done. They would have taken measures to quarantine the city of Wuhan long before January 23rd. So I think the reality is very clear. Wherever this originated, wherever the zoonosis made the jump to humans, we don't know if it was a wet market, so-called market for live wild animals, or whether it was in a laboratory. It kind of doesn't matter. It was clearly China. And the Chinese attempt to cover this up, at first, the delays in reporting the extent of the problem, the obfuscation, which the World Health Organization essentially went along with, created a global crisis. And then, to make matters even more infuriating, the Chinese began claiming that no, actually, the virus had originated in the United States and been brought to Wuhan by an American military team. A crazy bit of fake news that was being sent around social media by the spokesman of the Chinese Foreign Ministry. They then tried to back up their new role as the saviors of mankind with free masks and cheap ventilators, which they directed to Europe and elsewhere, and propaganda of the sort that one used to associate with the Russians rather than the Chinese. I don't think Italians have been particularly persuaded by this, judging by the reading I've done and the conversations I've had with people in Italy. I mean, some useful idiots, like elements of the Five-Star Movement, went along with it, just in the same way that there are people in Eastern Europe, like the president of Serbia, who buy this story. Doubtless he's well rewarded for that. But I think there's a good deal of skepticism amongst ordinary Italians. The interesting exception to the rule is Germany. Just recently, some new polling in Germany was published by the Kerber Foundation, which showed that the impact of the COVID-19 crisis has been much worse on German views of the United States than on German views of China. And the polling seems to imply that Germany would like to remain somewhat equidistant between the US and China. An extraordinary thing when you consider that since the late 1940s, German democracy has been dependent on a US military guarantee and has been consistently menaced by communist parties. So I think the German response to all this is a little strange. It's obviously actuated by anti-American sentiment and especially anti-Trump sentiment. But it does leave a bitter taste in my mouth to reflect that there is just so much antipathy in Germany towards the United States today that they're prepared to turn a blind eye to the obvious culpability of the Chinese Communist Party in this global disaster.
You wrote last year that we are now in Cold War II, and I think you were talking mainly about trade and technology. Obviously now this seems to be far more heated in terms of Trump blaming China, but actually the whole political spectrum in America taking a more anti-Chinese line. Firstly, how do you think a country can win the Cold War? What does winning the Cold War look like? And how do you think the pandemic will affect Chinese and American relations?
Well, Karen, I wrote that first piece about Cold War II back in February of last year. And I went a little further than you implied. I said the trade war is the obvious front, if you like, between the United States and China, and had been since the previous year when President Trump had started imposing tariffs on Chinese goods. But actually the tech war against Huawei, the tech race, the competition in artificial intelligence and quantum computing is much more important. And then there's the kind of classic geopolitical war that revolves around, say, China's turning the South China Sea into one large naval base. The ideological war that goes on, given that under Xi Jinping, China has reverted to actually quite a tight form of Leninism and one-party central control. So I think Cold War II was always about more than just trade and tech. It's just that it's escalated remarkably in the last few months. Maybe you thought that a common enemy like SARS-CoV-2 would bring mankind together. That's not the way it works. Actually, the US and China have drifted even further apart. As a result, partly of the pandemic, there's been heated exchanges between the US and China on that specific question. But there's a broader story here, I think, that China, in concert, I suspect, with Russia, is ramping up the information warfare. This is an election year, of course, perfect opportunity for foreign powers to seed American social media with fake news and toxic memes. I think the Chinese are now doing this. They're learning from the Russians how it's done. And it's adding, I think, to the Cold War atmosphere. The American public shifted on China, in some ways led by President Trump, because I think he can legitimately claim to have been the wake-up call to Americans about the Chinese threat. But now there's such bipartisan hostility to China that Joe Biden is having to reposition himself as more hawkish on this issue than Trump, which is a stretch because Biden, as vice president to President Barack Obama, was really part of a failed strategy on China over 8 years that was supposed to reorientate American policy towards Asia, the famous pivot, but actually ended up failing. And by the end of the Obama administration, they'd essentially accepted that China was going to overtake the United States. It's going to be hard for Biden to claim that he's tougher on China than Trump, but he's trying to do so. And the fact that he's trying to do so tells you that this issue has really become one of the very few issues on which there's bipartisan agreement in the United States. I think the big question is, does this Cold War stay cold? You asked, how do you win a Cold War? Well, part of the answer is you avoid it becoming a hot war. I mean, I think if the US and the Soviet Union had a hot war with nuclear weapons, the outcome might very well have gone the other way, because the US would have been much less able to withstand high civilian casualties than the Soviet Union, which had a track record of sustaining morale in the face of massive casualties during World War II. So part of the answer to the question is you have to keep the Cold War cold, because as long as it's a technological competition first and foremost, as long as it's a race to come up with the best AI and the best quantum computer and so forth, and for that matter, the best vaccine against COVID-19, I think the US is reasonably placed to win it, because it's just harder for a centralized one-party state to do innovation. It's just more difficult. There's just all kinds of blockages and disincentives to do original thinking in a communist state. Plus, they don't have the great advantage the US has of attracting talented immigrants from the rest of the world. I leave myself out of that category, but it's definitely one of the keys to the ability of the United States to out-innovate its rivals. But there's another part to this story. In order to win a Cold War, you also need to kind of outlast the opponent economically. And that's what happened in the 1980s. The US ultimately just had superior economic performance to the Soviet Union. And after a certain point, the Soviet Union couldn't, in fact, sustain itself because its business model was so flawed. I don't think it's so sure that this will happen in Cold War II, because I think China offers a much more formidable economic challenge than the Soviets ever really did. So I think we have to wonder about two things. Does it stay cold? Could it escalate to hot war faster than we expect, say over Taiwan? That's a real scenario we need to think about. And secondly, if it doesn't turn hot, does the Cold War nevertheless boil down to an economic as well as a technological race? And is China actually better placed than the Soviets were to win that?
You wrote your book Colossus back around the time of the Iraq War, arguing that America is an empire in denial. Would you still say America in denial? And is China a self-recognizing empire? And how will that affect the struggle between the two powers?
I stand by most of the analysis in that book. It was written at the time of the invasion of Iraq. And of course, there's been a lot of water under the bridge since then. But the central argument was that the United States was engaged in empire in all but name. It was an empire in denial. If you're trying to run Mesopotamia and Afghanistan, you're in the empire business, whether you call it that or not. But that the US was structurally not well suited to play that kind of role, because Americans, by and large, don't want to go and spend their lives in hot, poor, dangerous countries, because there was already a fiscal imbalance even in 2003 that looked like it was structural and pretty serious. And then there's just the fact that the American public loses interest in foreign wars and foreign occupations, usually after about 4 years. And that makes it really hard to sustain any kind of nation building exercise. I think all that's still true. And I think what we saw in the Obama presidency was one form of backlash against empire. Obama famously saying in 2013, "We're not the global policeman." And the Trump administration is just the second alternative flavor of that, which is a more isolationist America first mentality. But it amounts to the same thing. You're basically allowing voters to say, "We're tired of sending soldiers to these places that we can't even find on the map." And Trump has just continued an attempt by the Obama administration to disengage from these global commitments. But it's hard to do, even if you are an isolationist, as Trump has discovered. It's really difficult to just say, "Okay, everybody come home from Afghanistan. Okay, let's just stop supporting NATO." You try to do that, and then you discover that these commitments came about for a reason. So I think the United States is in this strange position that it's even more in denial about being an empire than it was back 17 years ago when the invasion of Iraq happened. And the public is even less enthusiastic about foreign engagements because things did not turn out well in Iraq and did not turn out well in Afghanistan. But the US is still stuck with these commitments. And in a crisis, it's still the US that's expected to take some kind of global leadership. And China's not really there to say, leave it to us. They can try, but as we said earlier, it's not an entirely credible pitch when you've just started a pandemic that you should take over global leadership. And here we find ourselves in a world where the two superpowers don't really want to have that kind of ownership, that kind of hegemony. And the European Union, which is the only other thing that resembles a superpower in the economic domain, is a complete pygmy in terms of military capability and relies on the US for security against any threat from Russia. That's the strange world without empire that we currently inhabit. And as I've tried to argue in previous books, a world without empire is not quite the utopia that you would expect if you had been thoroughly indoctrinated in the teachings of Lenin on empire and the evils of colonialism. A world without empire may in fact be a world of disorder, a world in which significant parts of the world descend into chaos. That's the overarching theme of work that I've been doing ever since my book on the British Empire back in 2002.
Just a general point about writing history now. I don't think people appreciate the amount of work that goes into crafting a piece of history. And so I want to ask, when you are confronted, say, for example, now you're researching for the second volume of Henry Kissinger's biography, when you're confronted with a mountain of sources, how do you go about crafting that chaos into some kind of structured narrative or argument? What's the process you use to write history?
Well, if particle physics is a kind of wonderfully cerebral activity in which one can sit, as some of my colleagues in physics do, and just think great thoughts about the structure of the universe, history is much more of a trade. You're essentially, as an historian, doing data processing on a large scale. That means reading thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of pages of old documents as well as secondary literature, and trying to make some sense of it. And as my career has evolved, I've operated at two different levels, one of which is primary source-based history, like the history of the Rothschilds that I did in the 90s, and this Kissinger biography, where I'm using the original documents, letters, diaries, anything really that's left lying around. And then at the other level, I'll periodically step back and write books that are really works of synthesis, drawing on other published works, books and articles, secondary literature. And I think you can combine these two approaches, and you kind of have to, because if you spend too long in the archives with too many piles of dusty documents, it's easy to lose sight of the bigger picture. And I think that there have to be these moments when you're up at 35,000 feet, as well as moments when you're down on the ground walking through the jungle. I think the key challenge for the historian is therefore just coping with the sheer volume of material that, at least in some periods, we confront. 70s was the age of, the typewriter and and relatively easy copying of documents, and so there's a huge mass of material which is accessible. That's a benefit. It'll be much harder to write the history of 2020 because it'll all be broken up into emails, and I suspect most of the key decisions won't be recorded and stored at archives. But it's also problematic because you're just overwhelmed with material. I really couldn't tell you how many pages of material I now have in my Kissinger database, but it's a shockingly large number. And I think if I read every one of those pages carefully, I would be probably reenacting Kissinger's life at real life speed, and I'd die before I finished volume 2. So I think the key is that you have to learn how to manage the data in ways that that essentially depend on speed reading. You have to read fast. Most people worry about being able to run fast more than they worry about being able to read fast. But I learned at Oxford and I taught at Cambridge that history is all about reading a lot fast and then processing it. And that means thinking. And a lot of people don't spend enough thinking time before they start writing. But it's actually the hard bit, that bit when you take the chaos, and real life is pretty chaotic, and it looks even more chaotic when you write it down. Take all that stuff and try and turn it into a coherent narrative. That's the hard bit. And that involves constantly tinkering with narrative structure and rethinking the way in which you're going to present the material. You've got to impose some meaningful order on it. Otherwise, people will just be bewildered by the chaos. And you can't really start writing until you've figured out a way of telling the story that organizes the material and makes it as intelligible as a novel. Novels are very intelligible because they're not coupled to reality. You can have consistent characters in plots that are easy to follow. And there are rules of narrative that you can stick to so that readers don't get lost. That's why there are really only a small number of plots in all of literature. In history, you're just doing a different thing. You're trying to get this mess of reality and turn it into a plausible narrative. And you need some kind of organizing principle. So in volume 1 of Kissinger, the organizing principle was, he's really an idealist. You've got this wrong. His basic responses post-1945 were idealistic to the challenges he faced. And organizing volume 2 is the next big challenge I confront, and I haven't quite figured it out. But that's why history is a peculiar activity, because you've got to be prepared to spend crazily long amounts of time plowing through the letters of people who are either very old or dead, and not going out to parties. You've just got to want to do that stuff, and you've got to get fast. You've got to do it fast, otherwise you get to the Robert Caro problem that you're actually not going to get through Lyndon Johnson's life in your own life. I really don't want to have that experience writing the life of Henry Kissinger.
Final question now. In terms of history, and you mentioned Cambridge, and something that makes me feel a bit depressed is seeing certain great historians who have operated in the past, and just wondering whether they are being replaced. I know when you were at Peterhouse, you were a contemporary of Maurice Cowling, you were good friends with Norman Stone, those kind of eccentric but incredibly gifted historians. Do you think it's a problem of universities, or am I just missing something and not seeing similar historians today?
The generation of historians who were active when I was an undergraduate was a pretty extraordinary generation. One should probably include in the same breath as Maurice Cowling, his arch enemy, Hugh Trevor Roper, who came to be Master of Peterhouse after many years at Oxford. And for all his faults, Hugh was an extraordinary historian too. And the list goes on. A.J.P. Taylor was the historian that inspired me to apply to Oxford to read history in the first place. And I still think anybody who wants to understand how to write really good English prose should read Taylor. He's up there with Orwell as a writer. Are there successors to these people? I think we'd have to take a long, hard look at the lists of faculty members at Oxford and Cambridge and Harvard and Yale and Stanford and conclude that the answer must be no. That there are really very few, if any, historians of that stature still writing. That's not to disparage my contemporaries in the historical profession. It's just to acknowledge that two things have happened that have made it harder to produce such giants. One is that the profession in the academy has gone down a road of specialization and fragmentation of the discipline, so that many people spend their careers writing only about, let's say, the social history of France, and they never really write about anything else. And so they're not capable of writing the big overarching works that the Stones and the Cowlings were able to produce. Credible works like Norman Stone's Europe Transformed, a brilliant work of synthesis that just dazzles on every page while maintaining that overarching argument that you need to get you through all the detail. The second thing that's happened is, of course, that being a conservative historian in the academy has become a kind of version of being an endangered species. There really aren't successors to Cowling and Stone in the way that one would have hoped, because the whole academic world has just moved to the left, to the point that there's active political discrimination against conservatives. If you're seen to be conservative, you can't really hope to get tenure at a major university in the United States. The data are very clear. US universities have moved further to the left over time. History departments have a staggering ratio of registered Democrats to Republicans. Last I looked, at something like 17-1 in favor of Democrats. And so the intellectual diversity that used to characterize history at Oxford and Cambridge, I think, has just dwindled. And that's a shame, because what made being an undergraduate fun in Oxford in the early 1980s was that you could hear outright Marxism from, say, Christopher Hill, on the same day that you had a kind of high Tory version of medieval history from Jeremy Catto. And you could go and listen to Isaiah Berlin if you wanted a kind of liberal position in the middle. I think we've lost that kind of intellectual diversity because there has been such a push for ideological homogeneity in the academy. So those things mean that you're pretty right to be a bit depressed. What's the consolation? The consolation is that the books still are there on the shelves. They haven't quite got to the point of burning the works of Norman Stone, though I'm sure there are a few people who would do that if you gave them a chance. And so you don't need these guys to be alive to read their work. And that's my approach. Just remember that books have a much longer lifespan than their authors, and the great works of history are still there. There's no obligation to read the most recently published books, though sometimes that's a good idea. And I don't want to conclude the interview by suggesting that history is entirely burnt out. I'm excited by some of the work that I'm reading these days by scholars younger than me. Kyle Harper's book on plague in the Roman Empire is a recent discovery that's been really exciting to read. And in some ways, I think that history is changing, and we're coming out of that period of the dominance of the left and the straitjacket of social history from below. and all that kind of stuff. As we do more scientific history, taking advantage of, for example, our understanding of genetics, our ability to understand the history of plagues in the very long run, our greater openness to people from other disciplines, I think we as historians have a chance to reinvent the discipline and get it out of this slightly depressed period that you've alluded to. I don't think it needs to stay this way, and I think there's actually a chance to use new insights, new disciplines to revitalize history. And yeah, maybe we'll get to some more exciting historians in the next generation.
I certainly hope so. Niall Ferguson, thank you so much for joining me. I've really appreciated it.
It's been a pleasure, Karen, and I wish you every success after your virtual graduation.
Thank you.